In 1999, deep in the quiet stretches of rural Alabama, a young couple seemed to vanish into thin air. They lived in a modest trailer, tucked away in a park where neighbors knew each other's routines and little ever changed. But on one ordinary morning, everything did. Inside that trailer, their 2-year-old daughter was discovered crying, scared and confused. It was her grandmother who made the haunting discovery. She arrived expecting to see her daughter and son-in-law going about their day. Instead, she found only the toddler, small, helpless and very much alone. The couple, however, was nowhere to be found. No note. No signs of a struggle. Not a single clue to explain how two adults could simply disappear while leaving a child behind. Think about that for a moment. Imagine stepping into the home of your loved ones. A child's toy still on the floor. Dishes waiting in the sink. The car sitting in the driveway. Nothing out of place, except for the absence of the two people who should be there. That silence, that emptiness, feels heavier than any scream. So where did they go? Who, or what, took them away from their home in the middle of the night? And why was their baby spared? If this was a crime, what kind of person would be cruel enough to erase 2 lives but leave a child alive to face the aftermath? Neighbors whispered theories, some too dark to repeat. The police were baffled. And for weeks, the community held its breath, waiting for answers that never seemed to come. But then, months later, far from that small trailer, hikers stumbled upon something in the woods. Something that would turn this missing persons case into a chilling, unsolved mystery that still lingers in Alabama's collective memory. Tonight we walk back into that story. A story of disappearance, unanswered questions, and the haunting discovery that would leave more shadows than clarity. This is not just about a young couple who vanished. It is about what was left behind, and the darkness that still surrounds their fate. Candice Kyser was just 19 years old in the spring of 1999. She had recently moved into a small mobile home in Fort Mitchell, Alabama, with her boyfriend, David Keller, also 19. The two were young, still figuring out life, but determined to build a future together while raising their daughter, a lively 2-year-old who was the center of their world. The couple's home sat in the Branching Pines Trailer Park, a quiet patch of rural Russell County where neighbors waved, children played outside until dusk, and word traveled fast if something seemed out of place. It wasn't a wealthy neighborhood, but it was home. For Candice and David, the trailer represented stability, a chance to carve out a space of their own. They were described as ordinary, hardworking, and devoted to their little girl. Friends remembered them laughing together on the porch, passing the baby back and forth, or sitting outside on warm evenings sharing cigarettes and cheap beer, the way many young couples do in their first place. They weren't perfect, but they were trying, and in their community people recognized that effort. On May 7, 1999, the night before everything changed, the couple was seen by neighbors. Nothing unusual. David was spotted outside, speaking briefly with a friend. Candice was at home, tending to her daughter. They didn't appear worried, they weren't packing to go anywhere, and no one reported hearing arguments or disturbances. For all intents and purposes, it was just another ordinary night. But by the following morning, their lives would no longer be ordinary. The first sign that something was wrong came when Candice's mother, Shalia, stopped by the trailer the next day. It wasn't unusual for her to check in. She was close with her daughter and especially with her granddaughter. What she found when she stepped inside is something no parent, no grandparent, should ever have to see. The little girl was alone. 2 years old, scared and crying. There was no sign of Candice. No sign of David. The young parents were simply gone. Imagine that moment. You walk into your child's home, expecting to hear her voice or see her moving about the kitchen. Instead, silence greets you. A silence so heavy it feels wrong. Then you hear the faint cry of your grandchild, the only sound cutting through the emptiness. You rush to pick her up, your heart pounding, but as you scan the room, dread sinks in. Where are they? The trailer itself told a strange story. Nothing seemed out of place. No broken windows, no forced entry. Candice's purse was still there. David's belongings untouched. Even valuables that might tempt a thief, a piece of jewelry, a television set, remained exactly where they had been left. The couple's car sat parked outside, keys inside, untouched. Everything suggested they hadn't planned to leave. And yet they were gone. Neighbors hadn't seen anything suspicious that night. No strange vehicles pulling in or out. No loud noises. No signs of an altercation. The only unusual detail was the toddler, left behind, unharmed but alone, as if deliberately spared. Police were quickly called to the scene. Officers combed through the trailer but found nothing useful. There were no fingerprints out of place, no blood, no weapon. The home felt frozen in time, as if Candice and David had simply stepped outside and never returned. Detectives questioned the family, friends, and neighbors. Had Candice or David been in trouble? Were there arguments with anyone? Did they owe money? The answers were frustratingly consistent. No. They weren't involved in drugs. They didn't have enemies. They were young, broke, and focused on raising their child. Still, investigators couldn't shake the most haunting question. If this was a crime, why leave the toddler alive? Whoever had taken Candice and David had either shown mercy or had an entirely different motive. But what motive could that be? Searches began almost immediately. Officers walked through nearby woods and fields, calling their names. Helicopters flew overhead, scanning the thick Alabama forest. Volunteers gathered at the trailer park, passing out flyers, pleading for information. Local news stations picked up the story, showing the smiling faces of Candice and David, urging anyone with information to come forward. But no one did. For days, then weeks, and eventually months there was nothing. No ransom notes. No calls. No sightings. The case seemed to evaporate into thin air. And yet, the image of that trailer, a crying toddler inside, her parents missing without a trace, remained burned into the memory of everyone who lived in Russell County. Imagine again being in Shalia's shoes, standing in her daughter's small living room, holding her grandchild close, and realizing that something unexplainable had just happened. No signs of escape. No signs of intrusion. Just absence. How do you even begin to process that? The police had no leads. Witnesses had nothing to offer. The case began to feel less like a disappearance and more like a haunting. It was as if the Alabama woods had swallowed Candice and David whole. And for the people who loved them, the silence that followed was the most unbearable part of all. In the days immediately following Candice and David's disappearance, Russell County law enforcement launched one of the largest search operations the area had seen in years. Deputies scoured the grounds surrounding Branching Pines Trailer Park, starting with nearby woods, dirt roads, and drainage ditches. Search dogs were brought in, their handlers directing them through fields and along the Chattahoochee River, which cut a winding path only miles from the couple's home. Volunteers from the community joined the effort. Neighbors who had known Candice as a little girl, family friends who remembered David from high school, even complete strangers who felt compelled to help, all showed up to walk shoulder to shoulder, combing through the heavy brush of rural Alabama. Flyers bearing the young couple's photographs were printed and taped to gas station windows, grocery store doors, and church bulletin boards. Their faces soon stared back from every street corner in Phoenix City and Fort Mitchell. Local news stations picked up the story, broadcasting updates each evening. Anchors spoke in somber tones about the missing couple and the baby left behind. Police officials gave brief press conferences, urging the public to remain vigilant and to report any tips, no matter how small. At first, it seemed like only a matter of time before answers surfaced. But as the days stretched into weeks, hope began to thin. Rumors filled the vacuum left by the absence of evidence. Some whispered that Candice and David had run away together, abandoning their responsibilities, though those who knew them quickly dismissed the idea. They adored their daughter and would never have left her behind. Others speculated darker scenarios, drug debts, jealous rivals, or even a family feud. But none of those rumors were supported by evidence. The police, meanwhile, grew increasingly frustrated. Each lead dried up. Each search turned up nothing. Detectives circled back to the trailer, re-examining the scene, but they were met with the same emptiness. No fingerprints out of place, no forced entry, no struggle. It was as if the couple had simply been plucked from their home and erased from existence. And yet, something unshakable hung in the air. A sense that the story wasn't over. That somewhere out there in the thick Alabama woods, the truth was waiting. But what no one knew then, was that the answers were waiting deep in the forest. It was late summer when the truth finally began to surface. By then the case had already gone cold. Posters of Candice and David had faded under the Alabama sun. The story had slipped from the front page of newspapers, replaced by fresher tragedies. But for their families the pain had not dulled. Every night, Shalia Kyser lay awake, replaying the moment she had found her granddaughter alone in that trailer, her mind torturing her with possibilities. Months after the disappearance, a group of hikers set out to explore a dense stretch of forest not far from Fort Mitchell. The area was overgrown, the kind of backwoods few people ever wandered into. Pines towered overhead, their needles carpeting the forest floor, muffling footsteps in an eerie silence. The hikers moved along faint trails, enjoying the solitude, when one of them noticed something unusual under a cluster of brush. At first it looked like nothing more than a mound of leaves disturbed by animals. But as they got closer the scene came into focus, something pale, something unnatural. They froze. What they were looking at wasn't just fallen timber or scattered trash. It was bone. Law enforcement was called immediately. Deputies descended on the scene, roping off the area and methodically documenting every detail. What they uncovered was grim. Beneath the leaves and soil lay the skeletal remains of two individuals. The bodies had been left in shallow concealment, nature slowly reclaiming them over the passing months. Forensic teams worked carefully, piece by piece, to recover what was left. Items of clothing still clung to the remains, familiar jeans, fragments of a shirt, a pair of shoes. The discovery was chilling, but confirmation was swift. Dental records proved what the families had already feared. The remains belonged to Candice, Kyser, and David Keller. The missing couple was no longer missing. The autopsies revealed the truth that had eluded investigators for months. Both Candice and David had been killed by gunshot wounds. Execution style. There was no mistaking it. This had not been an accident, nor a random disappearance. Someone had taken them from their trailer, led them into the woods and murdered them in cold blood. The news hit the community like a thunderclap. The case that had once carried a shred of hope now carried only horror. Friends and neighbors struggled to comprehend the brutality of it. How could anyone snuff out the lives of two 19-year-olds and leave their child to grow up without them? Investigators redoubled their efforts, combing the forest floor for evidence. Cigarette butts, beer cans and scattered debris were collected. But after months of exposure to the elements, much of what was recovered proved useless. There were no clear fingerprints, no murder weapon, no footprints preserved in the soil. What remained was little more than questions. Who had taken Candice and David from their trailer that night? Why had their child been left alive? And why dump their bodies in the woods as if they were nothing more than garbage to be hidden? The discovery provided closure in one sense. The couple's fate was no longer a mystery. But it also deepened the case into something far darker, something that to this day remains unsolved. The woods had given up their secret, but not their truth. When the skeletal remains of Candice, Kyser, and David Keller were pulled from the Alabama woods, investigators knew the case had shifted from a baffling disappearance to a double homicide. But even with the grim discovery, answers were still painfully out of reach. Detectives returned to the crime scene repeatedly, combing through the forest floor where the bodies had been found. They searched for shell casings, bullets, or any indication of where the victims had been shot. But nature had already worked against them. Months of rain, wind, and wildlife had stripped away nearly all evidence. The murder weapon was nowhere to be found. Without it, ballistics testing was impossible. The autopsy reports confirmed what investigators feared. Both Candice and David had died from gunshot wounds. Execution style. Quick, cold, deliberate. But beyond that, the medical examiner could provide little more. The condition of the remains told them the couple had been dead for months, likely since the very night they vanished from their trailer. So detectives looked to motive. Why would anyone want this young couple dead? At first, robbery seemed like the simplest answer. But that theory collapsed quickly. Their trailer showed no signs of forced entry, and nothing of value was missing. Jewelry, electronics, even David's wallet remained untouched. Whoever committed this crime hadn't come for possessions. The next possibility was drugs, a common thread in rural homicides. But interviews with friends, family, and neighbors painted a consistent picture. Neither Candice nor David had ties to drugs. They didn't sell, they didn't use, and they weren't known to run with dangerous people. So detectives turned to personal connections. Did they have enemies? Anyone who might want them out of the way? The answer again was no. They were young, working-class parents who mostly kept to themselves. They didn't start fights and they weren't involved in disputes. They were described as normal, ordinary. And yet, something extraordinary had happened to them. At the forest scene, investigators noted details that only deepened the mystery. Scattered near the area where the bodies had been found were cigarette butts and discarded beer cans. They didn't belong to Candice or David, according to their families. But DNA testing at the time was limited, and even if samples had been taken, contamination and weather made any results unreliable. There were also impressions in the soil, what might have been footprints, though they were faint and difficult to read after so many months. Were they left by the killer? By hunters? By hikers who had passed through long before the remains were discovered? There was no way to know for certain. The lack of evidence frustrated investigators. Every lead seemed to fade into nothing. And yet, the most chilling question lingered above all others. What kind of person spares a child, yet executes both parents? Was it the work of a stranger, someone passing through who saw an opportunity? Or was it far more intimate, someone they knew, someone close enough to walk into their trailer without forcing entry? Theories began to swirl. Some detectives leaned toward a personal feud, perhaps an acquaintance with a grudge, someone who wanted to make Candice and David suffer but couldn't bring themselves to harm the baby. Others speculated about a custody-related motive. Could someone have wanted the child, removing the parents from the picture to get to her? It was far-fetched, but the image of a toddler left alive while her parents were executed left investigators searching for any explanation. And then there was the possibility of random violence. A drifter, a stranger with a gun, who stumbled upon the couple and decided to end their lives without reason. But even that raised more questions than it answered. Why take them into the woods instead of killing them in the trailer? Why leave valuables untouched? Why leave a living witness, even if she was too young to understand? Each theory held weight. Each theory also crumbled under scrutiny. By the end of the initial investigation, detectives were left with little more than fragments. 2 lives stolen, a baby spared, and a crime scene that offered more questions than answers. As weeks turned into months and months into years, the case of Candice Kyser and David Keller slipped further into the realm of the unsolved. Despite interviews, searches, and appeals to the public, no one was ever arrested. No one was charged. And no new evidence came to light. The investigation simply ran cold. But the haunting questions never faded. Who had taken them from their trailer that night? They hadn't left on their own, that much was clear. Someone had come into their lives, interrupted their quiet evening, and stolen them away. Why was their baby left alive? It's perhaps the most unsettling detail of all. To execute 2 young parents yet leave their toddler unharmed suggests a decision, a choice made in the moment. Was it mercy? Or was it something else entirely? And why dump their bodies in the woods, partially hidden but not buried, as if the killer wanted them to be found eventually? Was it arrogance? Carelessness? Or a deliberate act meant to taunt investigators? No matter how many times detectives revisited the evidence, the story refused to give up its secrets. The cigarette butts, the beer cans, the faint footprints. All of it amounted to little more than shadows. And so the case sits in the cold files of Russell County, unsolved. The families of Candice and David still ache for closure, still wonder about the night their loved ones were taken. And their daughter, the toddler who survived, grew up without parents, her life forever shaped by a crime that Alabama has yet to answer for. Somewhere out there, the person who pulled the trigger may still be walking free. And that may be the darkest truth of all. From the moment Candice Kyser and David Keller vanished from their small Alabama trailer, the story has carried a weight of mystery that refuses to fade. It began with a grandmother's shocking discovery, their 2-year-old daughter, alone and crying in the silence of an empty home. No parents. No explanation. No trace of where they had gone. For weeks, the community searched. Flyers were taped to gas station windows. Volunteers walked dirt backroads calling their names. Rumors spread faster than facts, each one darker than the last. And then, months later, came the answer no one wanted. Hikers stumbling across skeletal remains in the woods, remains that would be identified as Candice and David. Both shot. Both discarded like they didn't matter. And yet, despite the discovery, the case raised more questions than it answered. There was no murder weapon. No fingerprints. No clear motive. Just fragments, cigarette butts, beer cans, faint impressions in the soil. All leading nowhere. To this day, the murder of Candice Kyser and David Keller remains unsolved. So we are left only with speculation. Was it a jealous ex-partner, consumed by rage and resentment? A stranger, a drifter passing through rural Alabama, who saw an opportunity and acted without reason? Or was it something far darker, a secret buried in the couple's quiet lives that has never come to light? And then there's the most haunting question of all. Why leave their daughter alive? Was it mercy or something calculated, a choice meant to make a statement? These are the questions that keep this case alive decades later. Questions that echo not only in police files, but in the hearts of a family still without answers. Now I want to turn the question to you. What do you think happened that night in Alabama? Do you believe this was a crime of passion, a planned execution, or an act of random violence? Could someone close to them hold the key to this mystery? Share your theories in the comments below. Maybe your perspective could shine new light on a case that has remained in darkness for far too long. Because sometimes answers don't come from detectives or labs. Sometimes they come from conversations, from collective eyes on a case that refuses to rest. And if mysteries like this one keep you awake at night, make sure you subscribe. Next week we'll step into another story, one even more disturbing, one that will leave you questioning just how well you really know the people around you. Until then, remember this: some stories end in justice. Others linger in silence. And somewhere out there, the person who ended the lives of Candice, Kyser and David Keller may still be walking free.